Horror films can keep you up at night with fears you didn't even know you had. They can get your heart thumping and adrenaline surging as you watch from behind your hands. Most horrors have many familiar qualities which make the watching experience somewhat predictable, from jump scares to creepy basements, abandoned buildings to ghostly mirror reflections. But filmmakers are increasingly trying to push boundaries and bring new qualities to a genre full of cliches and overused tropes. And every so often, there's a game changer which sets new trends for others to follow. Shocking narrative twists like The Sixth Sense and The Village, found footage like The Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity, political commentaries like Get Out and Us. It's fair to say it's an ever-evolving genre, though one that doesn't progress at a particularly fast pace. One director who's not afraid to shake things up and bring all new levels of fear to his films is Ari Aster. The American director made his feature debut with one of the most talked about films of 2018, Hereditary. The next year he released another genre triumph, Midsommar. Both films received mostly praise from critics and audiences alike for their phenomenal originality and attention to terrifying detail. No horror film had tested the limits of the genre in this way for years. Martin Scorsese said for him, Hereditary became disturbing to the point of being uncomfortably so. He also said, like all memorable horror films, it tunnels deep into something unnameable and unspeakable, and the violence is as emotional as it is physical. Speaking on Midsommar, he said, "It digs into emotions that are just as real and deeply uncomfortable as the ones shared between the characters in the earlier picture." It's no surprise Aster succeeded in bringing out these feelings in one of the most experienced and legendary cinematic minds living today, because he doesn't take any shortcuts or cut any corners when it comes to creating a visceral horror experience. Both of these films create fear that is so uncomfortable, upsetting, and primal that they left even the most experienced horror fanatics feeling panicky and anxious. One of the reasons Aster's two tour de force horrors were so original is because they lead you to believe you are in for one story when the reality is that a completely different tale awaits. In Hereditary, the earlier scenes in the film talk about the death of Annie's mother, Annie played by Toni Collette, and tricks naive viewers into believing they will be watching a ghost story, especially when Annie sees a vision of her mother when she turns the lights off. The séance she later takes part in also lends itself to this potential storyline. Other unnerving moments are sprinkled throughout the earlier scenes, like the bird flying into the window and Charlie snipping off its head. Her repetitive tongue-popping habit is also inexplicably unsettling. Something definitely seems off about her, but no one knows what. It leaves a deeply uncomfortable need for answers in an open narrative that could fire off in any direction. In a similar way, Aster uses the same disconcerting methods in Midsommar when establishing the narrative early on. When the group arrives at the Midsommar Festival in Sweden, they decide to take mushrooms. What follows is a hallucinogenic trip where Danny, Florence Pugh, becomes paranoid and panicked. The grief resulting from the recent death of her parents and sister looms over her and is painfully apparent for viewers. In what is the film's most classically horror moment, Danny sees the reflection of her dead sister behind her while experiencing the bad trip, a disturbing piece of imagery that Aster would later superimpose onto the trees during the pagan ceremony. The whole sequence is especially harrowing because it is grounded in real feelings of grief that don't just exist within the horror world. Again, Aster leads audiences to believe the film may be exploring something to do with the deaths we see at the beginning of the film, but actually moves in a different direction. Undoubtedly, the greatest similarity between the films is the way they use grief to penetrate into our deepest fears. In both Hereditary and Midsommar, Aster forces us to watch unimaginably tragic deaths and does not shy away from the grief that follows. In Hereditary, Charlie is beheaded in a car accident when she puts her head out the window, gasping for air as she suffers an allergic reaction. Her brother Peter swerves to dodge a dead animal in the road and forces Charlie's head into a post. It is so shocking that you almost don't believe it's happened. You hope that this was a horrible manifestation or alternative reality, but not only is it real, you are forced to live the horror with the one responsible for it. And it's especially upsetting, given the completely ordinary, feasible and accidental nature of it. Not to mention that at this point Charlie is a completely innocent child who has been killed by her ultimately good-natured brother. In an interview with Alex Wolff, who plays Peter, he spoke about the power of the sequence which sees him drive home and go to bed without saying a word or moving the body. He noted that he wasn't sure if he would have reacted any differently in these nightmarish circumstances. Asta also dwells on Annie's grief as we see her wail uncontrollably, screaming that she wishes she was dead. But this also continues beyond the initial hysteria, when Annie lashes out at Peter in a grief-stricken frenzy during a family dinner. We are forced to watch the aftermath of an unfathomable accident and witness a type of grief that we wouldn't even allow ourselves to imagine. It is so intense and realistic that it makes you want to physically remove yourself from these anxiety-inducing scenes. In a similar way, at the beginning of Midsommar, Dani shares her concerns on the phone with her boyfriend Christian about the well-being of her sister. Minutes later, she phones back and cries hysterically down the phone. The next sequence shows that her sister has committed suicide through carbon monoxide poisoning and has taken her parents with her in the process. Again, Asta forces us to witness the grief that follows as Dani wails in her boyfriend's arms, another excruciatingly upsetting scene. The audience's second-hand grief is intensified with the knowledge that Christian doesn't really want to be with her, meaning we know she has no real support system as she navigates grief, many people's worst nightmare. It seems as though up until now, many filmmakers have themselves been too disturbed by the idea of tackling such intense and realistic grief that they have avoided it. The final aspect, which is strongly mirrored in the two films, is the use of explicit physical violence. In Hereditary, besides Charlie's death, the most scary moment is undeniably the scene where Annie hangs from the attic roof as she saws away at her own head. In a prophecy-fulfilling act, she pulls back and forth on a blunt piece of wire as blood spurts out, and she gets faster and faster. The speed of the gruesome act paired with the gory sound is terrifying and one of the scenes that really lingers after watching. Midsommar uses a similar device, when two of the commune's elders commit a ritualistic suicide by throwing themselves off a cliff. Not only is the very prospect of it horrifying, but we see every gory detail, including the wheezing man who doesn't die from the fall, so has his head smashed in with a mallet. Again, the combination of death, violence, and ritual is a disturbing combination and one that is made to feel steeped in a not completely infeasible reality. After watching a horror film, certain moments may stay with you that you can't help but replay in your head. You may be able to reason with yourself about the things which are irrationally scary to you, telling yourself that it was unrealistic and just a film. But Hereditary and Midsommar remain disturbing long after you have seen them, because the scariest parts are not the ghosts or zombies or witches or any other horror cliche. They're the horrifying accidents and gut-wrenching grief, the crumbling personal relationships, the very real feelings and fears of the characters which exist in reality just as much as they exist in the films. Ari Aster broke new ground with these films and dared to send audiences to places they hoped they'd never go. And he succeeded so gracefully because he has a fundamental understanding of fear. He has set a precedent for horror films by not allowing viewers to sit comfortably in the knowledge that they can escape the fear once the credits roll, but rather force them to contemplate horrors that exist only in their worst nightmares.